Okay, welcome everybody to the second panel. We're very lucky to be joined by Dean Mohsen Mostafavi, who will do a brief introduction to this second half of this wonderful, wonderful symposium. Please welcome Dean Mohsen Mostafavi.
Thank you. Thank you, Juan. No, a few things. First of all, thank you very much for all of you being here. I know how much this event matters to so many of you. Hi, Janet. And also to Anita Berzbetia. And sadly, because of some family situation, she couldn't be with us. I know she really wanted to be here. So partly I'm here because I love this event, and I've sort of watched how it's been planned and been in progress. But I also know how much Anita wanted to be here and the fact that she cannot be. There are two things that are immediately kind of important. One is that you know that at the GSD, the whole focus with the group Women in Design has been an important part of the culture of the school, which in a way it's always been there, but it became even more focused a few years ago around the whole discussion of the Pritzker, and there are many political issues. It's not just about women in a way. It's really about the attitudes and the way in which there has been, in a way, a fundamental institutional kind of problem that has been at play. So we believe in really total equality and equity, and we find that there are institutions who have created complications. So it was really amazing to see how the GSD students and Women in Design, being not only women, but women and men, together can really address those issues. The other one is really the question around the importance of landscape architecture. And I think everyone knows that the school, especially over the last 10 years or so, has focused a great deal on landscape architecture because we feel that landscape architecture has gone through such a significant transformation in terms of the way that it positions itself and the way that it really impacts social transformation. Because in terms of people's perception, it has definitely shifted from being focused or being understood to be focusing purely on garden design or parks, and the scale of landscape has changed, and it's become much more obviously significant at the territorial scale and the way in which landscape really interacts with questions of urbanization more broadly. And I think in this school, we have obviously hired people, we have cultivated students, we've cultivated the kind of research that has been very important in terms of enhancing the value and the significance of landscape architecture. And that is also attested to by the kind of big research projects, by the growth of the Department of Landscape Architecture, and so on. At the same time, now we see that there is the juxtaposition of landscape architecture and Latin America. And this, again, is a topic that is very close to our hearts. You've seen last week we had the mayor of Mexico City here. Gareth Doherty and I spent some time in Chile and in Brazil to promote the Portuguese and Spanish edition of Ecological Urbanism. Charles Waldheim has been there. A number of people who've been involved with the school are playing very important roles, and it's fantastic to see friends of the school and graduates of the school playing such a key role in that part of the world. So one thing that is noticeable is now in the context of Latin America, as far as I can tell. One is really the question of pedagogy and the importance of landscape architecture as part of the future education or graduate education at institutions in that part of the world, and at the same time, it's really the importance of the discipline itself in terms of societal transformation, in terms of really big questions of urbanization. So I think this is why it's also so timely to have this combination of landscape architecture in Latin America. And I think it's also great then that this panel this afternoon, if I understand it correctly, will be dealing more specifically with around the questions of the role of academia and policy, which is featuring Fabiola, Elena, Loretta, and Marta. And I know that Sonia has already been introduced this morning, but she's also going to be moderating this session this afternoon. So please welcome Sonia Dumpelman, who will introduce. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. So I am charged here with moderating this session on academy and policy. And our first speaker is Fabiola Lopez Duran, who holds a PhD in the history and theory and criticism of architecture and art from MIT. Prior to joining the faculty at Rice University, she was the 2009-2011 Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the Humanities at the Department of History of Art at UC Berkeley. And she was, prior to that, actually was awarded a number of pre-doctoral fellowships from various institutions, including the Harvard Center for European Studies and the Fulbright Program. Fabiola is very interested in processes of modernization, in particular in Latin America. Her forthcoming book, Eugenics in the Garden, Architecture, Medicine, and Landscape from France to Latin America in the early 20th century, I just heard is now in press. Or? Yes, good. So I'm very curious to hear her contribution today, and please join me in welcoming Fabiola.
Thank you, Sonia, for such a lovely introduction. And thank you, the Women in Design group, Adria in particular, and the Latin GSD group, who are doing such a great activism and that put this together, that I'm really amazed by what I have heard so far. So what I'm going to share with you today is a little tiny piece of my book, Eugenics in the Garden, that is going to be out, hopefully, at the end of this year. I'm going to do a real effort to concentrate the main arguments of my book in a very particular case study that happened in a very single space in Rio de Janeiro. So let me just see how this works. So should I use this one? The green?
The green, big one.
Okay. So, my story begins at a critical global moment in which scientific discourses articulated in France crossed the ocean and then became intertwined with the discourses of architecture, aesthetics, landscape, and urban planning in early 20th century Brazil. At the epicenter of this ideological encounter was the utopian project of eugenics, the social and biological movement that strove for nothing less than the improvement of the human race, using heredity and environment as its primary tools. This very form of eugenics, based on Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of the acquired characteristics, conceptualized evolution as driven by adaptation to environmental changes, in contrast to Mendelian eugenics, let's say the mainstream eugenics, which view evolution as impervious to the environment and driven solely by genetics. The plot of my story is driven by Brazil's conviction that eugenics was its critical instrument in the crafting of a modern nation. The belief brought together a diverse cast of characters, politicians, technocrats, scientists, architects, and intellectuals alike. From the physicians, I'm wondering if I'm doing the right thing. Okay. From the physicians and architects of the Parisian Musée Social, the early French think tank that sought to address France's pressing social question, to the physicians and architects in Rio de Janeiro who formulated the theories, practices, and ethos of Brazil's social modernity, to Le Corbusier, who began formulating a eugenics ideology precisely during those months he spent in Brazil in the 1930s. My story's narrative revolves around these individuals, all converging in a particular territory at the center of Rio de Janeiro, essentially a eugenics laboratory. In the early 1920s, a highly dramatic event occurred in this very territory. The battle against the bubonic plague, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases had led to a radical sanitary and urban reform that reached its climax with the spectacular demolition of an entire populated mountain located at the center of the Brazilian capital. The idea of eliminating the mountain was not new. As far back as 1798, a medical report had argued for the mountain's demolition since, according to the author, it acted as an enormous barrier that blocked the circulation of air from the sea and consequently facilitated the proliferation of diseases. But it was not until the 1920s that aesthetics and moral reasons were added to sanitary ones that the mountain became the very negation of modernity itself, a reservoir of vice and disease, a place of a marginal population, mostly poor, blacks, prostitutes, and former slaves, who, according to the elites, invaded the center of the city, quote, with their embarrassing practices of superstition and misery, end of quote. At that time, medicine became the principal tool used by the elites to study and then reconfigure their national population. It was only at this point when hygiene, until then understood as personal or environmental, became social hygiene, and economic science concerned with the outputs of human capital, production and reproduction, that the demolition of the Morro do Castelo was possible. So this dramatic demolition, which generated an extensive territory immediately occupied by the 1922 International Exhibition commemorating the 100th anniversary of Brazil's independence, represented the first and most radical action in the construction of the new national image, free of backward associations and racial exoticism. In other words, the exhibition was conceived as a self-portrait of a modern nation, a nation that undertook a self-remaking process, not only of its milieu, but of its population. The more than 500-page catalog for the exhibition explicitly described the exhibition as, quote, the expression of the constructive energy of a new race, a race able to triumph in the battle between man, mountain, and ocean, end quote. Promoting itself as a tabula rasa, the exhibition represented a literal triumph over the territory, a territory now cleansed of its history and unwanted inhabitants. Its catalog is striking in its complete elimination of all traces of the African and indigenous component of the Brazilian culture. With the exception of one article briefly mentioning the abolition of slavery, the catalog presents Brazil as a quite white country. An examination of its images provides an excellent demonstration of a new alliance between beauty, health, tropicality, and modernization that the Brazilians adopted to represent themselves and their nation. As you can see, in most publicity materials, white men, women, and children of classic Greco-Roman appearance, wearing red, white robes and crowns, were arranged against a transplanted European-looking hill and gardens to frame the architectural and machinery of modern factories. And just as humans were portrayed as icons of the ideal, so too were natural monuments, released from the tropical fatality, politicized as new icons of collective identity, and moralized as elements of transformation directly linked to the reimagining of the body. In several advertisements, the catalog exalted the natural monuments of Rio de Janeiro, particularly those human-made or human-dominated. In fact, an advertisement for a medication portrays the Pão de Açúcar as one of the 7 wonders of the world. It also celebrates the Corcovado, the extraordinary mountain at the center of the Tijuca forest, the world's largest human-made urban rainforest, which will be crowned a few years later with a monumental 40-meter tall statue of Christ the Redeemer. raising the Morro do Castelo while transforming two other mountains within the city into sites of pure aesthetics pleasure. Tropical nature, now monumentalized, is portrayed precisely as the site of the interplay between the body, labor, and technology. But the exhibition not only represented a triumph over nature, but a triumph over degeneration. In fact, the first Brazilian Congress for the Protection of Infants, an essential part of the exhibition, was at the core of Brazil's transformation of puericulture, the French faith-based science, into a neo-Lamarckian form of eugenics, revealing the influence of French medicine on Brazilian medical circles. The debates in Congress focused on the importance of puericulture, the term that Adolphe Pinard, the French physician and member of the Parisian Musée Social, revitalized as a human analog of agriculture for the scientific cultivation of the modern child unit. Echoing Pinard, Brazilian physicians were convinced that puericulture, quote, a child was the result of two forces in equilibrium, heredity and milieu, and that consequently puericulture was one of the most accessible ways of conserving and perfecting the human species, end of quote, while whitening the population. Sorry, I forgot one, okay. So as the catalog was overrun by Hellenic-looking people, the demolishing mountain's footprint was suddenly overrun by neo-colonial pavilions, and even by a splendid hydroplane port built to provide a glorious entrance to the city. The adoption of neo-colonial architecture was followed a few years later by an invitation to French Beaux-Arts architect, a member of the Musée Social, Donat Alfred Agache, to formulate an urban plan in the language the elites had identified as their own. Curiously, the neo-colonial and Beaux-Arts styles were interchangeable as representations of the visual ideology of the country, and Agache's invitation suggests an interesting complicity between science and aesthetics in the practices of physicians and architects. Agache's proponents in Brazil were physicians supporting the neo-Lamarckian ideas proclaimed at the Musée Social, where both Pinard and Agache were active members. Of course, the elites were not a homogeneous group, but they seemed to agree on the image they wanted for their cities. Even Mario de Andrade, one of the main protagonists of the Semana de Arte Moderna, who celebrated Brazilian identity as a mixture of the foreign, the indigenous, and the African, and Lúcio Costa, the famous architect who will develop supermodern Brasilia, the capital ex nihilo of Brazil, were open supporters of José Mariano Filho, the Brazilian physician who became the most vehement promoter of neo-colonial architecture and also the main advocate for the appointment of Agache to develop the urban master plan for the Morro do Castelo esplanade. In 1928, in a series of articles, Andrade, in fact, celebrated the role of architects working for the normalization of the neo-colonial as the Brazilian national style. In many ways, the modern attitudes sought to homogenize the city and with it its population by eradicating undesirable inhabitants and proclaiming the esplanade to be a political and economic altar to power infused with white European forms. It was not a coincidence that all this, the demolition of the mountain, the elimination of the Rio de Janeiro's original urban nucleus that was in the Morro do Castelo, the displacement of its poor inhabitants, and the construction of the exhibition pavilions was executed almost simultaneously with the policies and mandates such as the white-only decree of 1921, which literally prohibited the immigration of blacks to Brazil. Nevertheless, it is interesting to observe how Mario de Andrade and the other organizers of the Semana de Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo, in their frontal attack on what they believe to be a false modernity, embraced by those controlling Rio's art establishment, paved the way for an art tradition that branded Brazil from then on precisely as tropical and heterogeneous. These three well-known paintings that I'm sure most of you have seen before by Brazilian artist Tarsila do Amaral brought to center stage two elements associated with backwardness: primitive, untamed nature, and those people who the elites wanted to overlook, Indians and blacks. These two elements were the very territorial targets of transformation of the eugenics movement: tropical environment and non-white people. The painting on the left, Abaporu, which means man who eats in Tupi-Guarani, the language of a tribe that was said to practice cannibalism, was the very painting selected to illustrate the 1928 Oswald de Andrade influential anthropophagic or cannibal manifesto. By adopting a metaphor for cannibalism and thus implying the need to eat the enemy to appropriate his best qualities, Andrade championed Brazil's digestion of European culture, metabolized now into something original, truly Brazilian. This was the first declaration of a culture unique to Brazil, in which anthropophagy became its constitutive element. In this way, the tattoo was transformed into a totem. But let's get back to the centennial celebration in Rio. One must ask, why did the organizers of this exhibition select the neo-colonial style to represent their new modern country in the centennial anniversary of their independence? In other words, what do these two images, white people and neo-colonial architecture, have to do with one another? No one illustrates this connection between race and style better than Lucio Costa, who in 1928 made this racist and forgotten link in a newspaper editorial. Quote, "I'm pessimistic about architecture and urbanism in general. All architecture is a question of race. When our nation is that exotic thing that we see on the streets, our architecture will inevitably be an exotic thing. It is not just those half dozen who travel and dress on Rue de la Paix, but that anonymous crowd that takes trains from Central Station and Leopoldina, people with sickly faces who shame us everywhere. What can we expect from people like this? Everything is a function of race. If the breed is good and the government is good, the architecture will be good. Talk, discuss, gesticulate. Our basic problem is selective immigration. The rest will change on its own." End of quote. Thus, the neo-colonial, which was in a sense anti-modernist, pro-Iberian, and white, was appropriated as the emblem of progress and modernity, suggesting that Costa intended for his eugenic syllogism of breed begetting good government, begetting good architecture, to work also in reverse. In any event, the neo-colonial white style, represented in almost every pavilion at the exhibition, was declared by the government from 1922 to 1938 to be the national style, mandatory for every building that would represent Brazil abroad. Perhaps this needs to present modern Brazil as a homogeneous white society was behind the omission of race as a demographic factor in every national census from 1890 to 1940. This omission was not the result of a need to promote a race-neutral society, but of the fantasy of a much-desired white Brazil. This is a very interesting diagram, and it was presented at the first Brazilian Congress of Eugenics in Rio to show the Brazilian whitening process that forecasts a country with 0 Negro by 2012. At the time, the diagram irritated everyone, but not because of its ideology, but because of the opposite, of how long it will take to achieve a white Brazil. Thus, I'm sorry, it should not go. so far, but okay. Brazil became a laboratory where the built environment was used as an object of racial transformation. In Rio, from the demolition of the Morro do Castelo to the use of neocolonial style as a symbol of white Brazil, architecture became a eugenic technology. In this context, it's very significant that Le Corbusier's working sketch for the series of lectures that he will deliver in Rio during the summer of 1936 placed the image of a simple man in a horizontal position at the base of his notes. Notice that in the last phrase of these notes, when Le Corbusier writes, "Achète livre Carrel," he reminds himself to buy the book by Alexis Carrel, the French Nobel Prize winning physician who had just published in 1935 his bestseller, Man the Unknown, a book later considered a manifesto for white superiority intellectualism. The rest is cryptic: Castelo, Lucio Costa, Carlos Porto, Pedro Aller Police, and Castelo Cliché. The sketch brings together the mountain Morro do Castelo with the names of Brazilian modern architects, the most important French eugenicists, and the representation of the simple man who became the object of transformation for Carrel, Le Corbusier, and as we know, for Brazil's government. What made Le Corbusier think of Carrel while thinking of Rio de Janeiro? Was Carrel's theory of the salvation of the white race at the core of Le Corbusier's ideas on landscape, urban planning, and architecture? It is not a mere coincidence that Castelo, the greatest eugenics laboratory in Latin America, is the first word that appears on the cardboard. It was the pulverized mountain from which hundreds of inhabitants were displaced. It was the esplanade that remained after this devastation that became the stage for the 1922 exhibition and its image of white Brazil. It was also the epicenter of a gaseous urban plan intended to cleanse the city of disease and undesirable, where he also visualized a tropical land cultivated and healed for the enjoyment of white people. And finally, it was also the name of the new building for the Ministry of Health and Education, the institution that will be in charge of developing and enforcing Brazil's eugenics policies for Getúlio Vargas' new authoritarian regime. The building for which Lucio Costa was chosen as the leader of the design team and for which Le Corbusier just happened to be invited as a design consultant will be located on the very site where the Castelo Mountain once stood. In fact, the association between Carrel and the built environment will become the trigger point for much of Le Corbusier's thinking over the next several years. But it was in Rio, during that summer of 1936, that Le Corbusier clearly aligned himself with Carrel's ideas. I promise I'm 30 more seconds. Evoking Carrel's eugenics book, Le Corbusier commented to his audience, quote, Plon, the editor who published my book on North America, celebrates the success of his latest book, Man the Unknown, by Dr. Carrel. Write, he told me, a book that will be an echo of that one. I will do it with pleasure, The Man and His Shells. This appears to be the very first time Le Corbusier made public reference to Carrel and his work. This cardboard note where he linked Carrel and Rio de Janeiro with the sketch of a man, was the spark for new theories first articulated in the Rio lectures that would become a Bible doctrine on the remaking of man, of a new entire way of life, of a new relationship between man and nature through which the built environment will be put to work. In the end, this is not just a story of Brazilian modernism, nor a story of European scientific concepts applied to the Americas. This is a transnational story that grapples with theories of modernity, modernism, and modernization, which places architecture at the very center of the eugenics agenda of white supremacy. So what the French thought was going to be the pure and direct materialization of Lamarckian eugenics, in fact, turned out to be much more a negotiation between positivist ideologies and Brazil's innovative approach to its racial and environmental reality. Thus, in its search for ameliorating the race, this new eugenics found in architecture, urbanism, and landscape design both its technology and its ultimate aesthetic form. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loretta. I'm sorry, Fabiola. This was a wonderful contribution. But next we have a tandem, actually, Loretta and Elena from Mexico. Loretta Castro obtained a B.Arch from the Universidad.Nacional.Autónoma de México and a degree from the Academia de Arquitectura de Mendrisio in Switzerland, where her thesis was directed by Peter Zumthor. She also holds an MAUD degree with distinction from Harvard University, from here, and she was also the 2010 Drucker Travel Fellowship recipient and has been awarded with diverse awards and prizes, such as the CIMEX, am I pronouncing this? Yeah, CIMEX, you say that this way? Okay, CIMEX Marcelo Zambrano Scholarship, the Abraham Zabludovsky Prize, and the Franke Young Creators Program Scholarship. She's the co-founder of Thaler Capital, and she has led projects with institutions such as the Institute of Social Sciences of the National Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and the Centro Mario Molina. And Loretta currently teaches at the School of Architecture at this university at Thaler Híbrido Urbano. And then Elena Tudela received a B.Arch with merit from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México in 2009. She earned an MAUD degree from the Harvard GSD in 2012, and a scholarship actually that brought her here then was what she was awarded for that purpose. So she is currently a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of Architecture at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and she recently received tenure as a professor and researcher at the School of Architecture, where she forms part of the Thaler Híbrido Urbano and at the Graduate Sustainability School. She recently coordinated the urban design and studio and participated in the design of La Quebradora Park in Iztapalapa. This is probably a real mess that I'm currently making of these terms, so please accept my apologies for this. I do need to kind of take up Spanish classes, I'm realizing here. So, but Elena also co-founded the Agencia de Resiliencia Urbana, the Urban Resilience Agency. So I'm looking forward to hearing from both of you.
Thank you very much for receiving us here. It's a great honor to be here at Piper and speaking again at the GSD. And we're going to be talking about the work we've been developing at the Taller Hídrico Urbano of the School of Architecture of UNAM, which actually somehow started in the rooms of this school. So to begin with, I want to show you Mexico City. Some might know it, some not. But this city, which is based upon a traditional Renaissance grid, used to be a lake system and was positioned on top of this system with a very sensitive urban design where the environment was totally taken into account for the design of the city. The city actually was built upon the system of chinampas and canals. This is a photo of Xochimilco, which is what remains today of the ancient way in which our city was developed. And I'm going to go back a bit to this map, which is the map of Cortés. It's the first map of Mexico City, the first ever drawn map. And it shows how the city was structured through 4 large avenues and a center, and was surrounded by these pieces of floating land, which are the chinampas that you can see here. So this waterscape was totally transformed, and its transformation was somehow slow and started with the Hispanic conquest. So we have a set of images here where you can somehow imagine how this happened, how the city center started with this traditional grid, and slowly the land surrounding it started to become desiccated and populated by the urban fabric. And the whole story happened and started with this artificial opening, which is called the Gash of Nochistongo. So Mexico City has this particularity of being placed inside what is called an endorheic basin, which is a closed water basin, no natural water exits, and that's why the basin holded this system of 5 lakes. When the Spanish arrived to Mexico and the conquest was done, the new urban system was somehow imposed based on these laws of Indies, which had these rules of how cities should be done, and it was established in that way. And the city, short after, started to become continuously flooded. And this became a very big problem. So 100 years after the city, the Mestiz city was founded, the engineers that were supporting this new urban design decided to open this gash so that water had a new artificial way of going out of the basin. And with this gash, a history of hard infrastructures started, helping the city become larger and larger. So this shows how the city was when the Spanish arrived, and then through these artificial openings, how the lake started to become desiccated, leaving free land for this infinite grid to expand until today, where this is true, and it happened in just like 50 years. We have no more lakes, and we have an enormous and infinite urban fabric. And today's basin, if you recall the other drawing, is like this. We have a very big city that works water-wise, based completely on hard infrastructures. So we import water and we export wastewater. We export wastewater through the largest wastewater drainage system in the world. It's really high-tech, and it's really big. And then we treat that water, or we will be treating that water also in the largest water treatment plant in Latin America. And then we import water with one of the largest water importation systems in the world. So as you can see, we are really top on this kind of technology. And then we also extract water from the aquifer through deep drainage wells that are compared to those that extract oil. The latest and the most deep that has been built, sorry, I'm going back, is 2,000 meters deep. And all this infrastructure, which is, as I told you, like top, is causing a lot of problems in the city because it has really transformed our natural environment. So the first thing is that the city is sinking. This is the Metropolitan Cathedral, who sank 10 meters in the last 100 years. And then urban floods, which are caused both by extraction of water, but also because of our ground, which is an impermeable ground, because it holded a lake. And then this urban hydric paradox, where we have not enough potable water, and then we have all those floods. So based on all this really compromising situation where there's no more space for drinking water, or drinking water has a really hard time to come into the city, we decided to start working on how a parallel system for providing a better water management to the city could start happening. And these are some examples of cities I visited with the Drucker Prize given by the GSD, about how other cities in the world have historically but also contemporarily handled water through urban design. This is a collage of the lake cities in China, Suzhou specifically, and how all these wetlands that surround the cities are transformed into rice grounds, and how the cities, although they are walled, are all constructed through a network of canals capable of managing water. This is Curitiba, which has a very big floodplain. The entire urban fabric is surrounded by green spaces. The lowest one is this one, so when it rains, the runoffs concentrate in this part of the city, causing no harm to the inhabitants. Or Venice, that is built completely thinking about how to capture every single raindrop that falls in the city with these squares, that are also cisterns and that have the wells that are able to open those cisterns and pull water from them. And then Hyderabad in India, which has a lot of cisterns that, or regulatory basins that are able to capture drinking water and that have lately been transformed into urban parks to protect those water basins. So based on top all these projects and on the very large problem that water means to Mexico City, in 2011 we decided to create the Taller Hídrico Urbano at the School of Architecture.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the THU, or Taller Hídrico Urbano, which means Hydric Urban Workshop or Studio, means and what it entails. It's been going on since 2011, but it's only been the past 3 years. It has been operating as a special thesis seminar with a special space for our students, which we get to select, and so it's got a lot of new opportunities. So part of the work we do, it's a 1-year-long thesis seminar, which Loretta, myself, and Yvonne Laviaga, incidentally all women, teach at the School of Architecture at UNAM, is working, as Loretta already mentioned a little bit, on alternatives to water strategies where we can connect hydric cycles with other types of contexts, such as geographic, social, and political, cultural contexts. So it's more like doing projects that are decentralized and that become a different way to practice with a water sensitivity. So these are the places we've worked before. So each year is one different site, and sometimes there's been a year where students pick their own sites, and so you can get to see more or less that we've only been out of the white line is Mexico City, and so we've only been out of Mexico City's limits once, which is Zumpango, the last remaining lake on the north. So these are basically the sites, and each year we switch. So what we use as a theoretical background for these students' work, because our students do not have a regional approach to problems, and as many Latin American schools, architecture is meant to be approached as a one-lot problem. And so we face with students interested in these scales and in sort of like working with landscape and working with urbanism as much as in architecture. So we need to give them some sort of framework for them to operate. And so we use several of the textbooks that we know from here, and that many of them have come from the GSD to sort of help them out in this multi-scalar approach. And so what's interesting is that they read certain texts and certain articles from these books and many others, but they do make their own mind in terms of how to adapt it to our local context. And those conversations become really interesting when each student uses them in different ways. So what we're most interested in is in applied research practice grounding Mexico City's environmental, social, and political aspects, which means landscape, even though none of us are landscape architects trained that way, landscape became the lens that allows us to actually approach these problems with a more or less complex, that we can use to understand the complexity that entails making all of these happen in the same project. So it allows us for a systemic thinking lens. So that's why we've been involved in landscape projects and landscape frameworks for all the work we do. And this is an example of the multi-scalar work our students do. This is all student work. And we get to see some regional master plans at some point. So depending on the site and depending on their approach and what the problem, how we define the problem, always when we talk about water and hydric cycles, we need to go to basins and we need to understand that type of topography, geology, etc. So sometimes it becomes a master plan, sometimes it becomes a very specific project at an urban level, and sometimes it becomes objects or even graphic work. Something that's very important for us at Taller Hídrico Urbano is that we link all our projects to real clients or necessities or real institutions that we work with. So we have some of them here, some are governmental, others are interested in projects, but like museums. So it's very important for us to always operate within a real context. And that has allowed for some of the projects to become a reality. And this is a case of Tlaltenco, a project that's near what Loretta described as Xochimilco with the Chinampas landscape. This is very close to that area and operated in a similar way at some point in history. And so this project began as a thesis seminar, and then it became a real client. Government, environmental agency became the client for this project. Unfortunately, it could not be implemented for political reasons, but the whole project took a different dimension when it became a real, true project. And these are some of the research lines that we have worked on, and this is all students' work. We have, for instance, the research on urban-rural landscapes, and a little bit we've talked earlier today about this one in particular, and how there are certain points where Mexico City is very interesting because we have a megalopolis, we have this huge city, but it has a lot of rural activity and agricultural activity still happening within its limits. So that makes it very interesting. And this particular project was done in the north, but was still very interesting in terms of how to make those happen and negotiate those needs. We've also worked within the consolidated city and how all of these lines of research are related to the urban and hydric context of the studio. But when we've worked with the consolidated city, it's interesting to try to find the gaps and to try to find the opportunities to operate within these two subjects, right? The city and its water needs. And these are some of the projects that have come as an outcome of that research. We have also worked with affordable housing, which in Latin America is a huge necessity, a huge topic to work on. And so what's interesting is that these students are not thinking in terms of just the house and how it works within just the unit. So these students are trying to understand what ties them to the water bodies that are close to them, the infrastructure that links them to the city, and how this goes back to the house itself, and they end up designing the inside of the house in resonance with that study. Then we have a lot of students interested lately in public space. So we're also working in terms of how water becomes the center of this public realm and how that shapes not only the physicality of the built environment, but also the culture and how we become more in contact with our condition. Currently, Mexico City does not understand its relationship with water, topography, its basin, even its conservation land, which lies on the outside of the city, and people are not conscious of that relationship, or even that the land that they're standing on used to be a lake. So these public space projects help understand that past and also change the way that we manage water and public space projects. We also have worked with tradition landscapes. I guess this happens a lot in Latin America, and it's very interesting because it operates how do you incorporate all these traditions that are currently taking place in the city but are not accounted for, and most projects don't take them into consideration, and so these projects try to do that. And another one is cultural landscapes. We've also recently tried to connect with a museum that's interested in the culture of water. And so that's like the poster of the exhibition where the students participated. And they've done these installations, art installations, working with different artists to understand how to make, do something in terms of the water culture in the city. And now we're going to talk a little bit about one singular project that we've been working on. And I leave it to Loretta to introduce the project.
So this project, which is called Parque Hídrico Quebradora, we decided to present it because it's been a very particular case. And it's been a work that has taken us around 4 years to develop. It started as a research project at the university. Then it was somehow left alone, so I took it upon the studio to continue it. And 1.5 years ago, we found the sponsorship of the government to make it real. So we formed a multidisciplinary team with people from the university, with architects, landscape architects, engineers, sociologists and biologists, and planners, politicians, to start putting this project forward. And what's interesting of this project is that for us it sets the beginning of a new way of managing water in Mexico City that could become an alternate and parallel system and infrastructure through landscape and soft strategies. So Quebradora is located in Iztapalapa. Iztapalapa is one of the poorest boroughs in Mexico City, and it transformed itself from the 40s to today, from first lake, then dry land, and now the city. The site had this use. It was not a regulatory basin, but it is capable of catching runoffs and making these runoffs infiltrate really quickly. So we took upon this characteristic, and after looking around it and examining it carefully, we realized that it became like a blocking part and a disused area public space speaking. No? So it became a barrier between these two areas of this borough, and it was also left with no other use but water management, so people didn't even understand that it had this purpose. This is how we found the site 1.5 years ago, and this is how the site looks today. We're not going to go too much in depth, it's just like a quick overview of the project, but with this material, we started the design transformation.
So this is sort of like what we envision for this project, and it's interesting because this project is currently under construction, so it's expected to be finished by next year, mid-next year, more or less. So for us it was an amazing experiment, first because of what Loretta mentioned, that we're designing with many disciplines, and for me it was the first time that we were trying to come up with a project that is not between 2 or 3 people, but between 20, 30 people, and even people that residents or citizens near the park would be involved in. And I mean, it's interesting to say this park is more important, is more relevant because of the site it's on. And it's a site, it's one of the most marginal areas within Mexico City area. Of course, it started being an informal area, and then eventually, well, the city just caught up with them. And so, but the poorest people live here. It's a very dense area, if not the densest of the city, and they have almost no green areas, public space available for them, almost non-existent. But they're also in contact with the mountains that you see at the back, volcanic mountains that are conservation land, but it's not, they cannot use it, they cannot take advantage of it as a public space. So this would really make a change in the way informal cities are retrofitted with this kind of projects. And here, well, we can see sort of like what Loretta already mentioned, the infrastructural character of this park was vital, was part of, the most important part of the park. And we also need to take into account that this park had to be very low maintenance. Remembering what was mentioned earlier today in terms of Chapultepec, I think it was Ana Maria that mentioned Chapultepec, which is this very iconic park. We know that that's not the way to go currently because of the means. We don't have the means to maintain it. It's one of the most expensive parks in all of Mexico City. So as much as we love it, we know the future does not hold many Chapultepecs. So we're thinking this medium scale park that actually has an infrastructural role is very important for public space, but also for water management. So it became a great opportunity. Luckily enough, it's still there, this infiltration basin. And we can see here some of the images that we're envisioning using materials, and this alluding a little bit to what has been said earlier today in terms of the rock. And we've thought about this a lot, the materiality of the public space itself, because it has to be low maintenance and it has to be easy to build, easy to everything, right? Cheap. And so the rock, which is sort of like the reason why the water filters right there, is because it's a rock bed. So we're using that rock to become part of the visual character of the park. And then also we are envisioning this park as an open museum of water management where people can actually begin to understand what happens to water when it falls and what role it plays, not as a closed lot that filters water, but actually as a place where you can see how it operates and how a wetland area cleans the water and allows it to become available for people of the area that have almost no drinking water. They have drinking water once a week, I think. More of these images. We have two main buildings that have some programs, such as a library, a bookstore, and a museum, and a cultural center,
stuff like that. Restrooms, because people don't have, as we mentioned, water in their houses, so restrooms were really important for the project. We have a huge amount of them. And this is the construction process that has already been going. And for us, it's important to talk about this park not only as an experience in design, but also as an academic experience, because we believe that the fact that an academic institution is behind it is what makes it feasible, is what makes people trust the process. And so I believe, or we believe, that Latin America has a huge opportunity within its academic institutions to make changes and to propose alternatives, because there's a lot of reliance on research that comes from them. And there's also the fact that policies, usually, at least in Mexico City, do not come before development. Usually development or informal settlements come in and then legislation catches up. So these kind of projects that may seem little or may seem small in proportion within the whole city become really important, because they start showing how things can be different, and then legislation can act behind it if social pressure is large enough behind it. And I think that's one of the important takeaways from our academic experience, and probably a discussion we can have later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elena and Loretta. So our next speaker is Marta Fajardo. Marta is a Colombian architect, urbanist, and landscape architect. She holds an honorary degree of Doctor of Letters from the University of Sheffield. And she is co-founder and CEO of Grupo Verde Ltda, a firm dedicated to the professional practice of landscape architecture, landscape urbanism, and urban design. She's also the co-founder and chair of the Latin American Landscape Initiative, and she represents the landscape architecture profession in the working group of the World Environmental Hubs Initiative, and she serves as the World Urban Parks Americas Region co-chair. So please join me in welcoming Marta.
Thank you very much, and to Harvard University and all the wonderful ladies who organized this event. My thanks forever. I was using the name you put on this symposium, and I was a little sad because I said Unpacking Theory, Practice, and Agency. And I tried to translate it into Google to understand what was the meaning, because unpacking, it doesn't translate correctly. Then I said, well, I will change my presentation into something which is not unpacking, no theory, yes practice, and a lot of agency. So it's with this one. Oh, what is the?
And that's the green.
Okay, the green one.
Yeah, the big one.
Okay, sorry. Latin America. You all imagine Latin America as vast, green, wonderful, diverse, erotic. An Amazon who spans 8 countries in South America and who has the highest diversity on Earth. And the Andes, which goes across Argentina to Venezuela. That's the land it happens I born in. It's a land, it's a territory full of knowledge, of traditional knowledge. Knowledge from our ancient cultures. knowledge that we are now trying to look and to understand, as we have seen the conference before me, to understand how the Aztec, the Incas, the Muiscas work with water, with land, in a very sustainable way. This Latin America, the crucible of intangible communities, how wonderful is Latin America. We can talk each other, even with the Brazilians, and we do understand each other very well. And it is the role, this challenge, that 80% of the population lives in towns. And Latin America is full of very chaotic towns, but also very creative cities. That's where the new paradigm of landscape architect is coming. Medellin, Curitiba, Sao Paulo, even in Mexico. So we always, when I go everywhere in the world, they always say violence, crime, cocaine. Yes, it's true. But also it's true of hope. And Fajardo Mayor in Medellin, he presents us from fear to hope. The hope that things can be changed. The hope that if we are close to the landscape and if we reside in places that are green, resilient, and livable, we will be good citizens. And that's something that we have learned. And that's why we are working together beyond borders, invisible borders, professional borders, political borders. Once we understand, like birds who fly on the air, working together, I'm sure we will be a better society. That's why I changed my presentation and I said, well, I must tell you a little bit of my life. A life which has been wonderful because of the landscape. The landscape became, at a very early age, the language of my life. A language that it happens to understand when I was a little girl and for the first time I saw the air. And since then I was fascinated by the colors, the immensity, but also the tiny, beautiful of the ocean, the mountains and the greenery, especially the greenery in Latin America. And then, at a very early age in my life, I understood the power of the landscape. It happens that I born in the most tiny place in Colombia, the coffee region, which produced the best coffee in the world. And I was a little girl. I opened the window in my farm and I saw this beautiful landscape. And it was a coffee sustainable production with trees, with bananas, with avocado, but also with birds, with butterflies, and beautiful workers that always smile, that make me, my life, a challenge. A challenge that when I studied architecture in Bogota, I didn't understood what architecture was about. Then I said I must go study a master in landscape design, no landscape architecture, design. And I went to England, Sheffield University, where I have a wonderful experience, and I understood that beyond cities, we have to work not only locally, regionally, but globally. And that's how in 2003, as an IFLA International Federation Landscape Architect, I was the president for 4 years. That's one thing that the curriculum didn't say, but that was a challenge. It was fantastic, 67 countries, and this little girl was dealing with a huge transformation of that fossil organization. And the right to landscape and the trans-frontier cooperation became my mandate. And I work influenced by a very old man who said, coming together is the beginning, keeping together is the process, but working together is a success. And we work together with the influence of the part of the European Landscape Convention. We start to work regionally. We went to UNESCO. We talked with the Union of Architects, the ISOCARP, the planners. Let's work together. Let's have a global convention of the landscape. But UNESCO, the Americans and the French, they said no. The rest of the world said yes. So we start to work regionally, and Latin American Landscape Initiative, the Australian Landscape Initiative, the New Zealand Landscape, African, and the Canadian. So we all mostly cover. We only need United States of America and India, and that will be the whole world. Why Latin America? Because I finished my role as an IFLA president, and still I have the energy to work with wonderful people, especially women, who all together we work with these guiding principles that we must recognize landscape as a vital. We have to consider all living beings, not only the nature, but also the butterfly, the bird, deal with everyday landscape, integrating biodiversity, expand knowledge, and inspire good practices and the legal aspect. So we make synergies with the Spanish Catalonia, Observatorio de Catalunya, and I just want to say the role of women in this initiative has been amazing, because we care for the land, because we understand the people, and because we know how to keep the house, and because we know how to talk with mayors in a very coquetto. I love you, Mayor. And so Mayor will say, do it. So in Medellin, 2012, we signed this initiative, 400 people. Diana was there. Diana is part of this movement of 18 countries: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, Paraguay, all under a concert. And butterflies like the Garcia Marquez, yellow, golden, and pink butterflies when we were signing this declaration. And we have been working since then very hard, every year. We meet all over Latin America. We set up different clusters. We work like cells. network of knowledge network that interlock, that learn each other from the other. And we have the cluster of education. This panel is education. I am not an educator. I am not an academic, but I am a dreamer. And a dreamer can sell many things. And we have the cluster of communication, education, civil society, which Diana is the leader, catalogs, and good practices. And we will celebrate the 5 years doing many things all year round. And I would love to invite all the students, all the Latins, and even the Americans who would like to be part of this journey to be with us. This is part of the coordinators of the initiative. Some are landscape architects, others economists, lawyers, politicians. And as I said, women, we have this leadership in the landscape field. Not only landscape architecture, we must work as a transversal, the landscape matters. And the second part of my speech, which is going to be quick, is about my professional practice. I have time to work also. And I will say landscape design in my own backyard. It's about connecting peoples. It's about building resilience. It's about inspiring vital and sustainable place. It's about love. It's about happiness. When you see this lady looking in my homeland after a terrible earthquake, 2,000 people died, and the town was destroyed. And we reclaimed that city by the landscape. The landscape became part of this, the new local economy in Quindío. And this is my office. And it happens that I married the most beautiful man, a Japanese. Can you imagine a Japanese with this person? And this man is a biologist with a master in landscape planning, and has given the office all the meaning from that humanism, that bound with nature that he has, and we have inherited from him. I will not talk about the projects. There are several scales. Many of them are now under construction. But what I want to tell you is that creating this statement, from the right to landscape, we need to demonstrate the value and power of the landscape profession. Creating places that are sociocultural, responsible, and sustainable is at the heart of what we do. The power of our profession is to show that places can be healthier, fairer, resilient, and greener. And that investing on the landscape is not a cost, but saving. It's a strategically designed tool that opens all both society and inverses physically and metaphorically. But now that in Colombia we have shake hands, we are now in a process of peace. The power of the landscape professionals is amazing. So in this exercise. We took a very complex area in downtown Bogota, and we start to think, how can we reclaim an urban landscape through tactic urbanism, social urbanism, and landscape urbanism? The three together are the answer to this proposal. And which matter most, everyday or outstanding landscape? Of landscape matters, yes, but the daily, the today's landscape are the most important. So, this is what the role of the landscape as an activism is very important. In this case, landscape architect with civil society in a bottom-up process beyond boundaries. We work with the community, we collect the budget, and we reclaim an urban park for the people, for the joy to be together, for a place where culture and encounters are every week. A place where people can, the fat, the black, the poor, the rich can be all together watching a film at night. So really landscape architecture is becoming a very important profession in Colombia. Not only that we are leading with the architects, the planners, but that mayors, institutions are becoming to understand what we do is very important. This is a project that we just won, and I am the leader. We have 45 people working together. It's 4,600 hectares, which is about 11 acres. And we have the budget, and it's going to be mayors of Bogota, largest park in Colombia. And this park will be his landmark on sustainability. And we are trying to understand the region because it is secret land for the Muiscas. So we will be doing a project that it is related to the nature of the site, always using birds. I admire birds. So I just would like to finish because I received the notice. And 2 minutes, coming back from my land. This is my beautiful land. We will celebrate in November the 5 years anniversary of the Lali. And you all are invited to be in this garden, to be in this sustainable region, which happens to be a coffee cultural landscape by UNESCO. And we will celebrate with a symposium, with a fair. We will make La Fiesta del Paisaje. And just we want in this symposium to present the Latin American Landscape Convention, but also the Colombian Landscape Draft Law. And in that event. And I will finish with this little boy I met in Cartagena de Indias when we were doing a very large project surround the walls, the fortification. He was so happy that we will make a park, a place for him, for his family, his friends. He's gone, but the air is coming. What a wonderful time to be a landscape architect, creating better places for people and for the planet, allowing us to build for the happiness and well-being. This delightful air contains everything we have: the joy of adult children, the quiet sunset, the coffee we drink, all the hopes and dreams for well-being. Today, this world looks small, fragile, and it behoves landscape architects, designers, to work with truly as ambassadors for the air landscape. This will lead to reconciliation and protection, not only for the environment, but for those who are oppressed. Gracias.
Thank you very much to all our speakers, and I would like to invite all four of you to join me on the panel. Thank you. Thank you very much again for these wonderful presentations. And I was wondering, while I was listening to you, so it seems all of you trained in architecture, is that correct? So maybe could you talk a little bit more as to what brought you to either a topic that actually deals, you know, in Fabiola's case, in part, at least with landscape, for example. So what brought you to landscape? We just heard the best advertisement for landscape architecture, I think, that I've heard in a long time. So, and now Elena and Loretta, you know, you being in an architecture school, but basically having adopted landscape architecture as the field, but also landscape as a medium that you're working with. So I'm wondering whether you could let us know more about this interesting transition in a way that has happened here. Why do you feel compelled to be working in these new areas now?
Well, I guess that there are several answers for that question. I was trained as an architect, and then I worked for several years in a museum as a curator of architecture, and also I taught at the university. But when I came here to MIT to do my PhD, well, this has to do with a personal story, but I was just out of a treatment. I'm a cancer survivor, so I was really interested in understanding what happened with the body. And I think that kind of personal curiosity brought me to take very MIT kind of classes, like in robotics and the history of the body and things like that. And I ended finding this fascinating connection between medicine and architecture, and the understanding of nature as something that is not natural at all. So in that process, I ended finding one important component of my research, which is the built environment as this incredible agent in the implementation of the eugenics movement in Latin, but the French eugenics movement that was medical in origin in Latin America. So let's say that something, the main thing that basically connects all the different components of my research is nature. And it's the understanding of nature. And it's the understanding of that there is nothing modern in modern Earth. I know that you are in this, you maybe are not, and you maybe don't agree, you disagree maybe with that idea. But you know, it's like a kind of like reality that I think that we need to understand in order to move forward.
Marta, there were at least 4 men in your office, correct?
Yes,
Yes.
there are men and women, and most of them, they are, one is engineer, but is a landscape architect. The other is architect, and also make landscape architecture. So all of them have a second title. But talking about why we choose landscape architecture when the profession is not, it was not common at all in Colombia. No school at all. There were only 2 landscape architects, and it happens that one of those, Alfonso Leiva, went to the university in the last year, and he gave such a wonderful speech that inspired a lot of people, especially 3 of us in that year went to Sheffield University, and the other colleague is Gloria Ponte, who has established the master's degree in Medellin. And you have seen all those fantastic projects in Medellin who are very much attached by this cosmovision of Paisa life. It's because of Gloria's department, the strong belief that we have to develop our own identity from the schools.
As for myself, I actually don't consider myself a landscape architect, although I know I deal with the tools. But I think what brought me to landscape is like this union of how I learned architecture, about how to understand a site and which things should be taken into consideration to design whatever you design, like from a spoon to a city, no? And then like about all this sensitivity that it needs to be put in place, about how you understand materiality, how you understand atmosphere, what needs to be taken into account. And then this together with what I learned here at the School of Design, and how you understand the strategies of the city and of the environment. And maybe these 2 put together are what somehow draws our practice into this side of more towards landscape when we talk about urban design and how we approach this urban design in a city like Mexico City. No? And obviously with the topic of water, which was born here from my thesis, no? It was my thesis that I started working on water in Mexico, how do you manage water in Mexico City, and then how it evolved with the Drucker Prize, the Taller Hídrico, and to the point in which we are designing parks, no? with this background. So somehow I see it more like a toolbox where you take what you have in hand and sensibly understand what the problem you're dealing with and how you respond to that problem. No?
Well, for me, I think I've been indoctrinated by the GSD to love landscape in so many ways. But then after leaving the GSD and practicing, I realized that urban design lacked, at least in the context of Mexico City, lacked that part that studied the environment as a more complex, natural, artificial entity, which required a lot of the knowledge that landscape architects have. So in a way, it's true that we don't have that. The School of Architecture at UNAM has a very small landscape department, and so it's still very incipient. And all of a sudden, we're being landscapers in a way.
Is there a lot of friction between what may still be diverse fields and diverse disciplines? We're not quite in the, I mean, I tend to say, yes, we are kind of post-disciplinary in a way. but not quite, right? You're still talking about departments. We certainly have our departments here.
Yeah.
So is there friction? How does this work out? What do your architect colleagues say, now that you're the ones who basically seem to be very successfully leading some projects here?
It's interesting, that question, because I believe that landscape, at least in Mexico City, is considered to be very traditional landscape architecture, not in the way of gardening, but in a lot of biological knowledge. And what we've been doing has more to do with infrastructure and a more contemporary lens to landscape, which is what's taught here. And so we're not competing. We actually we can integrate our work really well, which is interesting enough, because we don't have that knowledge in terms of biological information, but we do know how to make it work into a more systemic approach, so I would say.
And I would also add that us coming from the architecture department, they don't see us as aliens, no? It's somehow like, okay, they are taking that approach on whatever project they're doing, but it does feel a bit of tension when we deal with landscape architects, because somehow we step on their feet in a sensitive way, because we don't do it like we want to make them like step aside. Not at all. We include them in our projects because we lack that part that Elena is talking about. But somehow when we first arrive with the approach of what we're gonna try to solve, the way in which landscape architects treat us is like, to begin with, it might be wrong, no? And then maybe they give us a chance that it might not be that wrong, especially when we make them part of the team. So that's been like part of the strategy, is to incorporate all the professions in the team, because it's the only way in which we can work together in these kind of solutions.
So would you describe what you're doing more relating to urban design? So an urban design activity that maybe was not fulfilled by the architects in the department? And
yeah, what I would say regarding that, because when I was here in 2010, the Department of Urban Design and Planning was going through a rough state. Like the director was being changed, and there were a lot of changes. And actually, that's when they put together urban design, planning, and landscape, somehow in the same office. And that's how I was taught urban design. I think also Elena, because she was only 1 year after myself. So it was like a mesh of all these three ideas. So I think that's what we are trying to put forward, and that's it's somehow coming naturally, not with many.
We also need to open this up, but maybe one more question also for all of them, but Loretta, yes, absolutely.
Can I add just a little thing? Because this panel is about education. How to empower Latin America to have more schools. Actually, it has been a capacity knowledge project, which is led by IFLA, International Federation of Landscape Architects. It's co-sponsored by UNESCO, IFLA, and each university. And the first capacity project was done in Rio de Janeiro in order to teach professors that teaching in architecture or in geography to teach for landscape planning or landscape design or landscape architecture. The second one was in Medellin, and the outcomes has been very encouraging, because you will see how the profession is developing according to new schools in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, even in Venezuela with this crisis, and in Mexico. So I think one other matter, since we are here in Harvard and you have the power, that would be lovely if you can have a capacity knowledge project back in Latin America, because education is so needed. So it's a proposal.
Fabiola, where do you see kind of history coming into the equation? I don't know whether you have still a lot of contacts, personal contacts maybe to your native country and to universities in Latin America, because it also starts with with the teaching of history of the respective fields. So in this case, this would be landscape history or related design histories that relate to landscape, as you so beautifully showed us in your example.
Well, I'm Venezuelan, but my scholarship is not on Venezuela. So I had been working on this transnational connection between Latin Europe and Latin America, but specifically in Brazil, Argentina, and France. And right now I'm in a second project that has to do with Argentina, Uruguay, Cuba, and Spain. And I'm moving back and forth across the Atlantic with my research. I'm a historian, and I'm really interested in what art and architectural history has to teach history, plain history, and how history matters for political and social issues that we are living today. So my work basically focused on the first half of the 20th century, but I think that is really important for today's problems. I mean, the problems that we are facing today. So in my teaching philosophy, I will say that one very important thing for me is the transnational and interdisciplinary approach that allows us to see the complexity of the problems that we are visualizing. And because my main focus of interest is the built environment, it will go back and forth between art, urbanism, utopianism, landscape design and architecture, and engineering, geography, etc. So I don't limit myself in terms of what I found. It's what the archive tells me to keep going.
Right, thank you. So we have a little bit of time for questions.
Hi, my name is Pallavi Mande. I'm the Loeb Fellow this year at the GSD, and just first wanted to compliment you all. It's very inspirational. My contact with Latin America has been pretty limited, but I know being in the water field for as long as I have, I can see so many connections between the work you're doing and what I have been dealing with in the context of the US. My question really is, I was glad to hear Sonia frame this as how you all being traditionally out of the discipline of landscape architecture came to the realization that that's what the scale and discipline is, that you wanted to make your work relevant and influential. And personally, I'm coming from the urban design, architecture, environmental planning, trying to be a landscape planner, designer in this one year here. I want to understand that connection that you see in trying to bring multidisciplinary perspective to your work, and how much do you think is just you as a person, as a woman, feeling like the nature and landscape is a part of what you are and how you respond to the environment that you work in. I take 2 seconds to say, somebody who came to me wanting to work with rivers and saying, I don't really come from a traditional training in this, so how do I know it's something that inspires me, and how do I go about solving these issues that we see in our current rivers? And I could simply say, if you feel the river flows through you, you can definitely make a difference. So I just wanted to sort of put it back to you guys and hear your perspective on how much do you see this as a personal drive beyond the disciplinary aspect.
Well, thanks for your question and your comments. I think for me, I don't think it's a personal, I mean, it's personal in the way that I'm doing it, but I don't think it's a matter of personal experiences, because part of my PhD research has to do with resilience and resilience in Mexico City. And that, a little bit in the same way that Fabiola just mentioned, how history just makes her go through different disciplines without realizing the boundaries are there or not. I think when you talk about resilience, the same happens. You realize you're within borders of disciplines that require mediation, and sometimes you don't find what you need to be able to understand processes within one single discipline. So I don't think it's a personal project. I think it's a need. It's something that's happening whether we like it or not, because if we talk about certain topics, that's where it leads you. And the main problems, at least in terms of resilience, lie within those borders where urban development says, this is how as far as I go. I don't want to go into conservation land because that's not my thing. And then, you know, landscape architects or biologists or, you know, people studying natural environments say, I don't know about anything urban related. So then there's this point where things actually break, where that's the most dynamic border. And that requires that you understand both languages, that you deal with both, and that you try to mediate. So for me, it's personal for me, but I don't think it's a personal problem.
And I would say it also departs from an interest on making something change. I can speak that, like, in that sense, it's personal for me, because for me it's like really important to try to put a step on how water can be managed differently in Mexico City. And then you just need to flow, no? And it guides you, I don't know where. I'm still trying to decipher, because right now I'm in another set of different issues regarding the construction of the park, for example, no? So you start touching like any different kind of things, politics, deeply into politics, and how can you manage politics? How can you manage different groups of people, all the community, and then the same team, no? How you deal with teams with maybe 98 people or whatever, and everyone with a different interest, a different agency. So it's more how, if you want something or try to make a step on something, it surely brings you to enormous encounters with whatever, I don't know.
So to build on that, I was wondering if any of the panelists could speak to a bit about the translation of landscape architecture, both the history to various universities where you teach or work, and maybe also for the practitioners, how the translation of landscape architecture methods and maybe building methods are taught within each setting, and how those then translate to the built work that you're trying to get done in cities. So maybe just speaking a little bit to the work that still needs to be done, or the various ways to translate landscape history or methods to each setting.
Maybe I can comment about a course that I'm preparing that I'm going to teach in Rio de Janeiro for RISE students this summer. And it's a class about Rio as the city, but it's a class that basically is divided into 3 themes that I consider very important. And the first one that I call Paisagem, the tropical and the modern, is more about the engineering and the transformation of the engineering and the social engineering, just let's say the transformation of the landscape as a kind of environmental enterprise. So when you go from this kind of environmental thinking to a more political issues about the crafting of a nation, the modernization of a country, you go from, issues of engineer to issues of politics to aesthetics, let's say. And I think that at the end, when what you are doing in that very particular process of approaching landscape is trying to see how the most serious problems of today's time, from racism to climate change, the solution for them is actually in not only in the laboratory, but also in the humanities and in lessons that we receive from history. So I try to go back and forth in between history and practice in order to be pedagogical, let's say, for architecture students.
And you mean like regarding how you teach how to build landscape projects, or?
Specifically how to work with water in the context of a city. I think we're all still trying to learn in whatever setting, and even at the GSD, we are empowered with a certain set of theories and ways of learning here about those issues. And because you're working with students on a project right in Mexico City, it sounds like right now, I was wondering if there are specific things that you're learning on the ground.
Yeah, what we usually do is approach it from the strategy point of view. So the whole studio focuses on putting on the table like strategies for water management on a determined site. No, it depends. Each year it changes. So all of the time we do like a research part, and then there's like this very important moment in the semester when strategies must be built, and the students need to condense the strategy in a sentence. So when they get to this sentence, then we say, good, now you can start the project based on this strategy, no? And that's how we are trying to deal with how they approach water in a determined site from a standpoint, no? I don't know if that's somehow, I don't know.
Like, I'm trying to get to the fact that these projects need to get built, and how does that translate?
We don't teach that. We should teach that.
We're learning that.
But we don't teach that.
We're students of that still.
So we're almost running out of time, but there's one more question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Santiago. First, congratulations to the four of you. Great lectures. This question goes directly to Elena and Loretta. I'm Mexican. I've lived in Mexico City, and I've dealt with the complexities of trying to bridge the gap between academia and the real world, and also align yourself with your practice to huge and very like huge bodies of institutions that have a lot of inertia. And I feel that one of the key points that you touched upon, and Elena basically laid it out in a very clear way, was to try to blur this limit between what academia is and what the transformation of the city can be. I think that it's an exciting time to be in Mexico City and to be at the National University. I've seen from my side, but also with your work. So how do you see this process of interaction between academia and within academia teams of your nature and the institutions that actually guide actions to transform cities in Mexico City as a case study, but Latin America if you want to broaden the perspective?
Well, I think it's very political, as Loretta mentioned already, and you need to have a lot of, be very wise in those terms. Like, it's not easy. It's not easy to move around, not even within academia. And of course, we're talking about UNAM, which is one of the largest universities in the whole of Latin America. And, you know, it's a public university, so it has a different vibe. We have 5,000 students just in architecture. So it has a whole different magnitude. But it is very, as Loretta said already, we're learning how to move, swim in the sea of uncertainties and learning how to do that. And collaborations are basically the way we're finding how to bridge this. This project of La Quebradora that we presented operates within the Institute of Social Sciences, but and is linked to local government. But we're participating from the School of Architecture, and then we have the School of Engineering also providing what we need to be able to do this and implement it in real life. And so that, I think, it's an interesting question, because I think in Latin America, academia has a very important role, or can have, and it's an opportunity that we should take advantage of, because not only it's trustworthy for the people, which socially speaking in Latin America, we have that issue of not trusting whatever comes our way, no matter what. And so coming from these institutions is a huge progress. It's like having a key. And so you're already one step in. Now you have to deal with everyone, and with as we said, is designing with 50 people. It's a challenge. Even like, how do you design that? It can't be done on a paper because nobody can see. So you have to project it, and then like, what do we do? So it's still an experiment for us, at least for me. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's very interesting that way in terms of collaborations.
No, just quickly, I think what's like the good side of it, and what I've encountered is that as it's somehow a new idea, I mean, it's not new because it's been done in other parts and it was done before, but it's new to the time we're living. How I saw it is that there's this idea, there's a project that we think can work, and then we need to back it up really strongly so that we can present it to the authority, and so that the authority, the community buy it. No? So then we find UNAM as a really good backup for these kind of projects, which are large scale, and which also cannot be handled from a small studio, because government eats the small studio. In Latin America, I don't know if you know Latin America, in Mexico it happens so. If you don't have like a strong backup, then even money-wise, it's impossible for you to work with government. So when you work from the university, which is a very large institution and which has a lot of power, socially speaking, but also intellectually and trustworthy speaking, then you can put forward this kind of ideas, and it's hard for the government to eat the institution. Actually, it happens the other way around. So for us, it's been strategically to work with UNAM as a way to start pushing forward this kind of projects.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I think we have a coffee break. Do you want to make some announcements? Hi, so we're just going to take a 10-minute break. We have some coffee if you would like, but stick around. And we're going to invite all 8 speakers and our 2 moderators for a larger discussion.